Greetings, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is the Revisionist Fictions class for Lindenwood University's MFA in Writing program. This is the Shakespeare edition of this course. Last year, I taught a similar class for Lindenwood where we did revisionist works, but didn't strictly do Shakespeare. I was going to do that class again this winter, but when I talked with Beth, we kind of decided that maybe it would be interesting to do a little bit different approach. So I wanted to do this Shakespeare version. So specifically, as you know, if you've read the introduction to the class, that we're going to take a look at 4 Shakespeare plays. And then after each of those plays, we're going to read a novel, which was specifically commissioned by the Hogarth Shakespeare Press to be written, inspired by that play. I think it's going to be a really interesting quarter for a lot of reasons. I think it's a great combination of reading these classic Shakespeare plays, but also some novels by some of the most important contemporary writers working today, including, let me see if I can remember them all off the top of my head, Anne Tyler, Jeanette Winterson, Margaret Atwood, and don't tell me, Tracy Chevalier. There you go. And the idea of the class is that revisionist fiction is work that has been inspired by some previous work, some previous book, whether it's a play, as in this case, or maybe another novel or a poem or something like that. And one of the things we're going to talk about this quarter, not that it's our primary focus, but one of the things we're going to talk about is the difference, and if there is one, between revisionist fiction and fan fiction. Some people use those terms interchangeably. I tend to think of them as being different, although there's nothing official as far as I know in terms of what one is versus another. But I think it's an interesting issue, and we'll be touching on it now and again as we go along. Our primary interest in looking at these works, whether it's the Shakespeare or the contemporary novel, is to look at how the original inspired the contemporary author, and then also how it might inspire us. Revisionist fiction is something that I've been really interested in for the last, at least 20 years or so. I'm interested in revisionist fiction as a writer. Much of my work has been in sort of a revisionist mode. Not all of it, but a good portion of it, maybe even more than half of it. And also, as a teacher, I've used this approach where we've read an original work followed by some other work inspired by it in the service of trying to learn more about both, perhaps. Here, because our focus is a little bit different than a typical literature class, we're going to be looking at the works in terms of not only how did Shakespeare inspire these contemporary authors, but how might Shakespeare or possibly the contemporary author herself inspire us as writers? What might we be able to take away from these different books that might encourage us in terms of writing a short story or embarking on some sort of longer project, etc. And so let me just kind of quickly go through the books. I know you've got the list. For the Shakespeare books, I put the Folger Shakespeare Library editions on the syllabus. Obviously, there's lots and lots of editions, and I suspect probably all of you, or at least certainly the lion's share of you, were English majors before you got into the MFA program, so you probably have copious copies of Shakespeare. I have my Shakespeare shelf right up here behind me, just as a matter of accident, really. But I have a bunch of different versions of these plays from different publishers and so forth. But I like the Folger versions for a couple of reasons. One is, as you know, the Folger Library in Washington, D.C. is sort of the global epicenter of Shakespeare studies. And so the Folger editions are really well done, very scholarly, very up-to-date. One or two of the editions, I think, are actually 2017 copyrights. So they are really, really recently revised, and then the others are within the last 2 or 3 years. So very up-to-date in terms of the scholarship, in terms of the discussion of them from a sort of contemporary standpoint. So that's a plus. Also, these versions are inexpensive. You know, this we're going to start off with the Taming of the Shrew, and there's that version. And again, paperback, very inexpensive, but a wonderful edition. If you want to use a different edition, that's fine. Obviously, you very well may have plenty of copies of Shakespeare around, or maybe the and collected works of Shakespeare, one of those books that weighs about 80 pounds or something. And that's fine. In fact, it might be kind of interesting, as some of you might be able to add to our discussions because of some of the notes and commentaries that are in some of those other editions. And I certainly, I've pulled from some additional editions for some of my introductory notes in the course online and so forth. But if not, and if you went ahead and got the Folgers, then in some cases you'll be able to read a little bit further into some of the notes that I've alluded to in the course introductions already, and very well may allude to further as we go along. So again, we're going to start with the Taming of the Shrew, as I mentioned, and then the book that is that has been written, and inspired by Taming the Shrew is Vinegar Girl by Anne Tyler, and it'll be interesting to see what she has done with Taming of the Shrew, which is one of the most popular Shakespeare plays, still being produced all the time. It's definitely part of the canon that is read a lot in high schools and college courses, and as I say, produced, and obviously it's inspired a lot of movies and so forth, and that kind of thing. So we'll see what Anne Tyler does with Taming of the Shrew. And then we're going to read Othello. Here's the Folger edition of that. One of my favorite plays, highly complex, as all Shakespeare plays are, but in these contemporary times particularly, I think there's a lot of issues that are extremely relevant to life and times now. And so we'll be reading Othello after The Taming of the Shrew and Vinegar Girl. And then the novel that inspired is titled New Boy by Tracy Chevalier, and be interesting to see what she does with Othello and some of the themes and so forth that she picks up on there. And then both of those Shakespeare works, Taming of the Shrew and Othello, were earlier in Shakespeare's career. And then towards the end, a couple of the works that are well known, and one more than the other. One of which is The Winter's Tale, which will be next on the syllabus. And Winter's Tale, also one of my favorites. Very strange play, but I think it has a lot of interesting issues that we can look at, particularly in terms of the structure of the play. That's one of the things I find most intriguing about it. So we've got that on tap. And then for that play, the press asked Jeanette Winterson to write a contemporary novel based on that, and she wrote The Gap of Time. Winterson is one of my favorite contemporary authors, very, experimental, deals with a lot of really kind of cutting-edge contemporary issues and so forth, so that should be really interesting to take a look at that. And then the final play that we're going to look at, I know I keep saying these about all the plays, but this also is one of my favorites, The Tempest. And as I say in my notes, a lot of Shakespeare readers view The Tempest as Shakespeare's final play, at least the final play that he was the solo author of, and read a lot of the lines, particularly by Prospero, as maybe Shakespeare's kind of final words to the theater and so on. Not everyone agrees with that, which is one of the issues we can kind of look at as we go through. But that'll be the final Shakespeare work that we do. And then the novel that inspired by Margaret Atwood is Hagseed. And Margaret Atwood is just like one of the hottest writers on the planet right now, in large part because she's a great writer, but also because of the Hulu series on The Handmaid's Tale. Also, there's a Netflix original series based on her novel Alias Grace, which is also terrific. It's a shorter kind of mini series, as we used to call them back in the 70s kind of thing. But see what Margaret Atwood has to do with The Tempest. And so those are our readings. And as I say in my introduction to the course, the the main focus is looking at these as writers and looking at them for how they might inspire us in our own creative works. But because, of just the nature of literature, I'm sure we'll be getting into discussions of these plays and novels just as pieces of art, pieces of literary art, and discussing them in those contexts as well. Now, you're going to write, obviously, every week. Hang on, one of my dogs is about to bark. There she goes. It's going to happen every time. Hang on. I'm back. So we're gonna look at the plays and the novels as literature, of course, and discuss them in some context in that way. But also, because we're writers, for your two big papers, the midterm and the final, what I'm going to invite you to do is to be inspired and to try your hand at writing some creative writing, some fiction, presumably, based on one of the works that we've read up to that point. And partly it'll be your creative writing, and then also reflecting on what you drew from in the original work, and so on. Again, those are your larger papers, your midterm and your final. Obviously, each week we'll be posting on the discussion board and responding to each other's posts and so forth, which is pretty typical fare for an online class. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, I taught a very similar class about a year ago using different texts besides Shakespeare, and that seemed to work very well. And the students seemed to enjoy it, particularly the creative writing aspect of it. I think some of the folks kind of surprised themselves and wrote some pieces that they really were happy with and were planning to work with them further after the course was over. I don't know if that happened or not, but I certainly hope that it did. So I think that'll be very good. Just a couple of words. Obviously, I'll be monitoring the discussion boards virtually every day. Maybe on the weekends, I might miss a day or something like that. And certainly, you can post to the discussion board questions and so on. But I would actually recommend that you also email me if you have a particular question. And if it's the sort of thing, which it often may be, where my answer would be of benefit to everybody in the class, I'll just go ahead and make an announcement and share that information. But otherwise, it might take me a little longer to get back to you if you post to the discussion board, whereas I'll be checking my email sort of obsessively and much more likely to get back to you sooner rather than later if you just email me with issues or questions and that kind of thing. We're really looking forward to this class. I think it's going to be great. And I see a lot of familiar names on the roster, and that's always good to see and work with some of you folks again. And then there's some new names. That's also exciting to get to know some new folks out there. And so there you have it. Looking forward to Revisionist Fiction's Shakespeare edition.